Rome had chased Antiochus out of Greece. But now the Roman army was crossing into Asia, where Antiochus was waiting with elephants, cavalry, and a massive army. Alright, so Rome had already beaten Antiochus III in Greece. But do not let that fool you. The war was nowhere near over. Antiochus had escaped across the Aegean Sea and returned to Asia Minor. And now Rome had a choice. It could stop. Or it could follow him. Rome chose to follow. That decision changed everything. Because this was no longer just a fight over Greece. Rome was now entering the lands of the Seleucid Empire. And that meant something huge. Rome was about to fight in Asia for the first time. Look, Antiochus was still a serious threat. He had not lost his empire. He had not lost his money. He had not lost his army. And he still had access to soldiers from across his huge kingdom. His defeat at Thermopylae had hurt him. But it had not destroyed him. He still believed he could turn things around. And honestly, you can understand why. Antiochus ruled one of the biggest kingdoms in the eastern Mediterranean. His empire stretched across a massive area. It included parts of modern Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Iraq, and lands farther east. This was the world left behind after Alexander the Great. Generations earlier, Alexander had smashed the Persian Empire and created one of the greatest kingdoms the ancient world had ever seen. After Alexander died, that huge empire broke apart. Different generals took different pieces. One of those generals was Seleucus. His family built what became the Seleucid Empire. And by the time Antiochus III came to power, the kingdom had already gone through years of trouble. But Antiochus was different. He wanted to rebuild it. He wanted to bring lost lands back under his control. He wanted the Seleucid kingdom to matter again. And for a while, he did exactly that. He fought enemies in the east. He took back territory. He pushed his power into different parts of Asia. People started calling him Antiochus the Great. That name tells you a lot. This was not a small local king. This was a ruler who believed he belonged among the great powers of the ancient world. And then Rome entered the picture. At first, Antiochus probably thought Rome was just another Western power. A powerful one, sure. But still far away. Rome had already defeated Carthage. It had defeated Macedonia. It had built strong relationships with Greek cities. But Rome was still based in Italy. The Seleucid Empire was based in Asia. There was a whole sea between them. That distance mattered. But Rome had learned something from its earlier wars. Distance was not going to stop it. Alright, so, after Antiochus lost in Greece, the Romans did not simply send a message saying, "Good game." They wanted him pushed back. Far back. The Roman leadership understood that if Antiochus remained strong in Asia Minor, he could come back later. And Rome did not want another war in Greece a few years down the road. So the Romans decided to cross the sea. The Roman army was commanded by Lucius Cornelius Scipio. But there was another famous name with him. His brother was Scipio Africanus. Yeah, the same Scipio who had defeated Hannibal at Zama. That made this even more interesting. Rome was sending one of its most experienced commanders into Asia. And Scipio Africanus was there to help. Think about what that meant. Hannibal had once brought Rome to the edge of disaster. Scipio had learned how to beat him. Now that experience was being brought into another war. And Rome was about to face a completely different kind of army. Not Carthage. Not Macedonia. The Seleucids. Okay, so, getting the Roman army into Asia was not simple. The Romans had to move men, horses, supplies, weapons, and equipment across the sea. They needed ships. They needed allies. They needed food. They needed roads. They needed safe places to move. And they had to do all of this while operating far from Italy. That is a big deal. An army can win a battle and still lose a war if it cannot keep itself supplied. Rome understood this. That was one of the reasons its alliances mattered so much. Rome was not fighting completely alone. King Eumenes II of Pergamon was one of Rome's important allies. Pergamon was in Western Asia Minor. And that meant the Romans had friendly territory close to the fighting. This gave Rome a major advantage. Antiochus had home territory. But Rome had allies. And those allies could provide information, food, troops, and support. So the war was becoming bigger than two kings. It was becoming a fight over who would control the future of the Eastern Mediterranean. Look. Antiochus also had his own allies. But his biggest problem was that many Greek states had not joined him in the way he expected. He had entered Greece believing he could gather a large coalition against Rome. That did not happen. And now he was back in Asia. Rome was following him. The pressure was getting worse. Still, Antiochus had one thing that Rome could not ignore. A huge army. His army included different types of soldiers. There were Greek-style phalanx troops. There were cavalry units. There were archers. There were skirmishers. There were heavily armed soldiers. And there were elephants. War elephants were one of the most frightening weapons in the ancient world. Imagine standing in a line of soldiers. You have a shield. You have a sword. You can see the enemy across the field. Then the ground starts shaking. You look ahead. And huge elephants are coming toward you. Yeah. Pretty wild, right? But elephants were not magic weapons. They could panic. They could become difficult to control. And if the enemy knew how to deal with them, their advantage could disappear. Rome had already seen elephants before. Hannibal had used them. Pyrrhus had used them. So Roman soldiers were not completely new to the idea. That experience would matter. Because Antiochus planned to use elephants as part of his battlefield power. And he had another advantage. He could choose where to fight. The Romans were moving deeper into Asia Minor. Antiochus had to decide where to make his stand. He eventually moved toward Magnesia. And this place would become famous. The battle that happened there would decide the war. But before that battle, something important happened. Rome had already shown Antiochus that it could move faster than he expected. The Romans crossed the Hellespont. They entered Asia Minor. And Antiochus was forced to react. Think about that for a second. A Roman army had crossed from Italy into Greece. Then from Greece into Asia. This was a huge change in Rome's history. Rome was no longer just defending Italy. It was no longer just fighting nearby enemies. It was starting to act like a power that could reach across the Mediterranean. That was the real story. The battle itself was important. But what Rome was becoming was even more important. Alright, so Antiochus still had a chance. He had the land. He had the numbers. He had cavalry. He had elephants. And he had a powerful army built from many different military traditions. The Roman army looked different. Roman soldiers fought in a more flexible way. They were used to working in smaller groups. They could move. They could adapt. And they had already survived some of the worst battles of the ancient world. That mattered. Because Antiochus had a large army. But a large army is not automatically a good army. You can have thousands of soldiers. But if they cannot work together, those numbers can become a problem. And that was about to happen. Look, there was another important difference. Rome was fighting for a clear goal. Antiochus was fighting to protect his position. Rome wanted him pushed out of Greece and Asia Minor. Antiochus wanted to keep his power and stop Rome from getting deeper into his territory. Both sides had something to lose. But Rome had momentum. And momentum can be scary. Once an army starts winning, its soldiers begin to believe they can win again. Rome had that feeling. It had defeated Carthage. It had beaten Macedonia. It had defeated Antiochus in Greece. Now it was entering Asia. The Roman soldiers were not walking into this war thinking they were helpless. They were coming in with confidence. And Antiochus needed to break that confidence. He needed one huge victory. One battle that would make Rome think twice. One battle that would force the Romans back across the sea. So he gathered his army. And he prepared for Magnesia. This was the moment he had been waiting for. But Antiochus had no idea that the battle would expose the biggest weakness in his entire war plan. He had built an army that looked terrifying from a distance. But Rome was about to show what mattered when the fighting actually began. Alright, so, the armies finally met near Magnesia. And this was not going to be a small clash. It was a massive battlefield. Antiochus had a large force. The Romans and their allies were smaller. That difference would become important. Because when you have fewer soldiers, you cannot afford to waste them. Every move matters. Every mistake matters. Every opening matters. Scipio knew this. And that is where Roman experience came into play. The Romans did not need to destroy every soldier in Antiochus's army. They needed to break the army's ability to fight. That is a very different thing. If you can make one part of an army run, another part panic, and another part lose contact with its commander, the whole force can start falling apart. And that is exactly what began to happen. Antiochus placed his cavalry on one side of the battlefield. He personally commanded part of it. This was one of his strongest weapons. Roman cavalry was not as powerful. But Rome had allies. Eumenes of Pergamon brought troops that helped the Roman side. The battle started. And at first, things were not simple. Some parts of the Seleucid army fought hard. Antiochus himself had success on his side of the battlefield. His cavalry pushed back Roman forces. For a moment, it may have looked like Rome was in trouble. But this was only one part of the battlefield. And that is the danger of a huge army. You can win in one place and still lose everywhere else. While Antiochus was pushing forward, other parts of his army were struggling. The Roman side was able to pressure the Seleucid center. The famous phalanx was there. Long spears. Tight formation. Rows of soldiers packed together. From the front, it was scary. But the phalanx had a weakness. It worked best when the ground was open and the formation stayed together. Once that formation became crowded or broken, things got much harder. Roman soldiers were good at fighting in less organized spaces. They could move around. They could attack from different directions. And once the Seleucid formation lost its shape, the long spears became less useful. Now imagine hundreds of soldiers packed together. Everyone has a long spear. Everyone is trying to keep formation. Then suddenly the enemy is moving around the sides. The front cannot turn fast enough. The back cannot see what is happening. Commands become harder to hear. Men begin pushing into each other. The formation starts breaking. And once that happens, the advantage disappears. That was the nightmare. The Romans kept pushing. The Seleucid army started losing control. And then the elephants became part of the problem. The elephants were supposed to help create fear. Instead, some of them became difficult to control. The Roman soldiers attacked them. The elephants panicked. And when frightened elephants turn around and run, they do not care who is behind them. They can crash into their own soldiers. That is exactly why elephants were dangerous for both sides. They could destroy the enemy. Or they could destroy your own formation. Antiochus's army was starting to collapse. And this is where the battle became almost impossible to save. Some parts were still fighting. But the whole army was no longer moving as one. The Romans kept pressing. The Seleucid soldiers began to retreat. Then retreat became flight. And flight became disaster. Antiochus realized he had lost. He left the battlefield. The king who had entered Greece believing he could challenge Rome was now running from a Roman army in Asia. The battle was over. But the consequences were just beginning. Alright, so Rome had won at Magnesia. But Rome did not completely destroy the Seleucid Empire. That is important. Antiochus still ruled his kingdom. He still had land. He still had power. But his position had changed. He had been beaten. And the terms forced on him were painful. The Seleucids had to give up territory in Asia Minor. They had to pay a huge amount of money. They had to reduce their military power. And they had to give up much of their influence in the Aegean world. Rome had basically said, "You are no longer the power that decides what happens here." And Antiochus had no choice but to accept. That is a huge moment. Because Rome had entered Asia as an outsider. Now Rome was helping decide what happened there. Think about how crazy that is. A few generations earlier, Rome was still fighting for control of Italy. Then it fought Carthage. Then Macedonia. Then Greece. Now it was defeating one of the great kingdoms that came from Alexander the Great's world. Rome was changing. And the Mediterranean was changing with it. But there was something else going on. Rome had not simply conquered the Seleucid Empire. Instead, it had shown the eastern kingdoms that Rome could interfere in their politics. Rome could bring an army across the sea. Rome could defeat kings. Rome could force treaties. Rome could decide who gained territory. And once a power learns it can do that, it usually does not stop. That is the part of the story that matters most. The war against Antiochus did not make Rome ruler of all Asia. Not even close. But it created a new pattern. Rome would enter Eastern politics. Then it would become more involved. Then more involved again. And eventually, Roman armies would control huge parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. The war with Antiochus was one of the steps that made that possible. Look, there is also a human side to this story. Antiochus III had spent years trying to rebuild his kingdom. He had fought wars. He had won victories. He had taken back lost lands. He had built a reputation. People called him the Great. And then Rome arrived. One decision changed everything. He entered Greece. He thought he could challenge Rome. He lost. Then he tried to defend Asia Minor. He lost again. And the kingdom he had spent years rebuilding was weakened. That does not mean Antiochus was a bad commander. He was not. He had achieved a lot before this war. But he faced a power that had become very good at fighting long wars. Rome could lose battles and keep going. It could replace soldiers. It could raise money. It could build new fleets. It could find new allies. And most importantly, Rome had a political system that could keep pushing even after setbacks. That was one of Rome's greatest strengths. Not just the sword. The ability to keep coming back. And Rome's enemies kept learning that lesson. Hannibal learned it. Philip V learned it. Pyrrhus learned it. Antiochus learned it. You could beat Rome in a battle. But beating Rome as a whole was much harder. That is why Rome became so dangerous. Alright, so, after the war, Rome's influence in the Eastern Mediterranean grew. Pergamon became stronger. Rhodes gained influence for a while. Macedonia remained under Roman pressure. Greek cities understood that Rome was now the power they had to deal with. And the Seleucid Empire was pushed back. The old balance of power was changing. Before this war, Rome was mostly seen as a Western Mediterranean power. After this war, that was becoming harder to say. Rome had crossed the sea. Rome had defeated a major Eastern king. Rome had taken territory from the Seleucid side. Rome had forced Antiochus to pay. And Rome had shown that it could reach deep into Asia Minor. That was the beginning of something much bigger. But Rome still had a strange attitude toward empire. It often claimed that it was not trying to conquer everything. The Romans talked about freedom. They talked about protecting allies. They talked about restoring order. But every war gave Rome more influence. Every victory created another ally. Every ally created another reason for Rome to get involved. And every new involvement created another war. It was a cycle. And Rome was very good at it. That is why the war with Antiochus matters. It was not simply Rome versus one king. It was the moment Rome began pushing into a world that had once been dominated by the successors of Alexander. The Greek world had already felt Roman power. Now Asia Minor felt it too. And the Eastern kingdoms had to pay attention. Because Rome was no longer far away. Rome was coming east. Yeah, and there is one more thing we should not forget. Rome's victory at Magnesia was not just about soldiers. It was also about planning. The Romans understood that Antiochus's army had different parts. They knew the elephants could become dangerous. They knew the phalanx had limits. They knew cavalry could be powerful. And they used allies to make up for their own weaknesses. That is what makes ancient battles interesting. It is not always about who has more soldiers. It is about how those soldiers are used. Antiochus had a huge army. But huge does not always mean better. Rome had fewer troops. But they were easier to control. They were experienced. And the Roman command structure was built for this kind of fight. The result was brutal. The Seleucid army could not keep its whole line working together. Once the line broke, the battle moved quickly. And Rome took advantage. That is a lesson Rome would use again and again. Find the weak point. Break it. Then keep pushing. No fancy trick. No magic weapon. Just pressure. And that pressure changed history. Alright, so Antiochus survived the battle. But his dream of restoring Seleucid power in the West was over. The Seleucid Empire would continue for many years. But it would never have the same freedom to act in the Eastern Mediterranean. Rome had drawn a line. And that line was now much farther east than it had been before. The Romans had also learned something. They could operate overseas. They could fight in Asia. They could defeat a major Hellenistic army. And they could force kings to accept Roman terms. That knowledge was powerful. And Rome would use it. Over the next century, Roman power in the Eastern Mediterranean would keep growing. Sometimes through war. Sometimes through alliances. Sometimes through political pressure. Sometimes through inheritance. But the direction was clear. East. More and more east. And eventually, Rome would take control of much of the Greek world and the lands around it. The Roman Republic was becoming something much bigger than the city-state it had once been. But that growth came with a price. The more territory Rome controlled, the more problems it created. More provinces. More enemies. More political fights. More generals with armies. More money. More power. And eventually, those pressures would help destroy the Republic itself. But that is another story. For now, look at what happened to Antiochus. He started as one of the most powerful kings in the eastern Mediterranean. He wanted to rebuild the glory of the Seleucid Empire. He saw weakness in Greece. He thought he could use Greek support to challenge Rome. Instead, Rome defeated him. Then Rome crossed into Asia. Then Rome beat his army at Magnesia. And after that, Antiochus had to accept Roman terms. One king lost a war. One republic gained a new world. And honestly, that is what makes this story so important. Because Rome did not become a Mediterranean superpower in one battle. It happened step by step. One war. One enemy. One victory. Then another. The war against Antiochus was one of those steps. And once Rome took that step into Asia, there was no going back. Alright, so, remember where we started. Rome had conquered Italy. Then it defeated Carthage. Then it pushed into Greece. Then it defeated Macedonia. Then Antiochus came. He thought Rome had gone too far. He thought the Seleucid Empire could push Rome back. But Rome did something its enemies kept underestimating. It kept moving. It crossed the sea. It followed Antiochus into Asia. And at Magnesia, it proved that a Roman army could defeat one of the great armies of the Hellenistic world. That was a huge moment. But it was not the end. Because Rome's eastern story was only beginning. The Seleucid Empire would survive. Macedonia would survive for a little longer. Greece would remain restless. And Rome would keep getting involved. Soon, another Macedonian king would rise. Another war would begin. And this time, Rome would destroy Macedonia for good. Then Greece would face an even bigger change. The Roman Republic was becoming the master of the Mediterranean. And the closer Rome got to becoming an empire, the more dangerous its own success became. So yeah. The war against Antiochus was not simply a victory. It was a warning. Rome had learned that Asia was within reach. And once Rome knew that, the map of the ancient world was never the same again. Rome had already defeated Macedonia, but one king refused to accept Roman power. Perseus was ready for war. Rome versus Perseus. Watch the full story on Natioryx.